Hey everybody, welcome back to the So We Speak podcast. This is Cole Fakes. I'm joined by Terry Fakes. We are talking about finding Jesus in the book of Ruth today. And if you listen to our episodes on Joshua and Judges, maybe some of the more difficult books to find direct links to Jesus. Of course, we believe he can be found everywhere. Ruth is a home run ball. This little book is packed
Yeah,
full of things that point to Jesus. And so after those two, I think we were due for an easy one.
I think so too. Ruth is interesting. It's tucked in the historical books. You have obviously Joshua, then Judges, and at the end of Judges, it does merge very nicely into First Samuel, Samuel being the last of the judges. But tucked in between is this little book of Ruth, which occurs in the time of the judges. And it's a little gem, and it certainly points to Jesus as much as perhaps any other book in the Old Testament.
It does, and it'd be interesting to know. Not we can't know this at this point, but it'd be very interesting to know. Maybe in heaven we can ask around. How did this book get written? Not by the compiler
Right.
of the Judges or by Samuel, kind of tracing the history. It is this nice little standalone. It's a one contained story about this family, and yet it is so essential. You've got to have it to piece things together to see God's purposes and his promises. But you just have to wonder, why this was written as a separate piece and not included in some of these others, and how that came about. Of course, there's no doubt that it was cherished by the Israelites and it was in their canon. But you wonder sometimes if you get back behind into the mind of the author, they needed to tell this story and it was not included elsewhere. And boy, I'm glad they did.
It's not intuitively obvious, though, that this would have been a valuable book to the Jews. I mean, from an intuitive perspective, because you basically have the Jews and then intermarrying with a Moabite woman. And needless to say, Israel didn't have the best relationship with any of their immediate neighbors, whether it's Ammon or Moab or Edom, excuse me. All of them at one time or another have been at war. So on the surface, I think it's not obvious that, oh, well, yes, we need this because this is going to point to Jesus. But if you go back, why did the Jews preserve this?
Hmm.
And I think it's because God wanted this preserved, but it's not immediately obvious that this would have been a book the Jews would have liked. It's like, are you kidding? We're looking at Boaz, an upstanding Jew, marrying a Moabite woman, and
Hmm.
on the surface, it's not obvious, but
Well, it's one of
it
those that is strange enough to be true
right,
because this is
exactly,
not something that you would have made up. It doesn't play to the strengths of the people of Israel, and it utilizes the failures of the people of Israel to accomplish God's plan. So,
right.
one of the things we'll come back to is when you look back at the genealogy, you see that these Gentiles have been included in the genealogy. And that is not something that the Jews were supposed to do, but
Right.
because they did not push out the Moabites from the promised land, because these two young men did intermarry with Moabite women, God was able to use that and he was able to do it exactly in line with what his plan was all along. And so, yes, it doesn't look immediately great on the people of Israel, but it looks great on God, and that's one of the reasons it's such a great story. When when we start to think about Jesus in this story, we're our approach in all these books has been the entire Bible points to Jesus. Some of it is really obvious, and those are the big
Hmm.
interstate highways that lead you to Jesus. Some of them are not that obvious, and there's a delicate balance of following the grain of the Bible as it takes you to Jesus. There's ways to jump to Jesus too quickly, and then there's ways to
Hmm.
read things without any reference to Jesus that misses what Jesus says in Acts and in Luke 24. All the scriptures point to me. So, what I like about some of these books is there are little country highways and there are
Hmm.
interstates and there are neighborhood roads. The
Hmm.
first thing that came to my mind when we were reading back through for this episode, I would consider a state highway. It's a very important theme in the Bible but it's not immediately obvious in the story that it points to Jesus. And that is the principle of a kinsman redeemer. Now, this is a very Bible study phrase. Probably people that have
Right.
been in church have heard this. It's talked about a lot, kinsman redeemer. It's a great tagline. If not, you've never heard this phrase before in your life. What does this mean? It appears a couple of times in the book, but not quite in this phrase. So maybe we start out and say, what is a kinsman redeemer, and how does it play a role in this story?
That's a great question. The idea of a kinsman redeemer seems to have had a couple of purposes to it. So, in its simplest form, for example, you have two brothers and one of the brothers dies. It is incumbent upon the surviving brother then to perpetuate his brother's name by taking his brother's wife to be his wife and to basically perpetuate his brother's line. This had to do with two things. It had to do with keeping property in the family, and it had to do with continuing people's lines. So it was a very socially useful idea, keeping property and people within the Jewish community and the strong bonds of family. So you can add to that, but in a nutshell, it seems that that idea that as a kinsman, as a relative, I have an obligation to you, to our larger family, and not just to myself.
Yeah, I think that this seems like a very weird thing to us, and in our culture, it would be an extremely weird thing. In fact, it would be illegal to do this in our culture. But there's a couple of things culturally that you have to see for this to make sense. First of all, as you mentioned, the law of Israel functions beyond just what's morally good for me and my family, what I should do and not do to other people. It functions as an entire way of running a society. And so this is important in the ways that we read things on slavery, for example, in the Old Testament. We can't read our version of this back onto that because the culture was different. And that's not to say that there weren't
Hmm.
abuses of slaves or that abolition of slavery generally, not just American slavery, is the trajectory that the Bible takes. But it is to say that in certain circumstances in the Old Testament, it was a form of maybe what we would consider like bankruptcy law in the way
Right.
that they dealt with other people. And God, through the laws that he gives that are countercultural to the cultures that are around the Jews, things like the Jubilee, where things are restored to their people, God puts all this framework in place essentially as a way of people taking care of each other, even when really bad things happen. And this is the context of the kinsman redeemer. If in the ancient world, the family was the key unit. So don't just think
Right.
a man, a wife, and kids. Think the extended family, or in this passage that we're going to read here in Ruth 2, in a clan, a group of
Hmm.
families. And the patriarch of that group had a responsibility to take care of those in that group. And there were certain things that could
Hmm.
happen, like this. You could have a widow. Now the widow needed to be taken care of because in the ancient world, there was
Right.
no way for a widow to take care of herself. So you have these principles in place that when things happen, when somebody gets disconnected or disenfranchised, they would take care of them and they would keep them in the family. And one of the ways of doing that was this kinsman redeemer.
Hmm.
One of the background commentaries put this in a way that I thought was helpful. The kinsman redeemer's role is to help recover the tribe or the clan, the family group's losses of any kind. So if those losses were human, for example, so let's say somebody in the family has been killed, the kinsman redeemer or the leader of this family would pursue justice in whatever form, either with the judge, with vengeance. You know, you can see this going all kinds of different ways. Judicially, they would assist in lawsuits. Economically, if you lost your property, say, for example, you went bankrupt and you had to give yourself into
Right.
slavery, the kinsman redeemer would be doing everything they could to buy you back. And that's
Right.
where we get the word redemption. This redemption is kind of a financial concept to buy something back that has been forfeited or that has been lost. So in this case, what happens is you have Ruth, who is a Moabite woman. She's married to an Israelite man, and he dies. And her mother-in-law, Naomi, who's also a Jew, decides to go back to her homeland, and she decides to go as well. The reason they do this is because they've got to reattach to the family. All the men are dead. There's nobody to provide, there's nobody to earn a living, there's nobody to work the fields. They've got to get back into their family group. And the way they end up doing that is they find the kinsman redeemer. And so you see this happen in the story in chapter 2 when they go back to their hometown, and Ruth goes to glean in Boaz's fields. The reason they do this is because Naomi tells her, this guy that you're talking about, that Boaz, he's one of our family. May he be blessed by the Lord, she says, whose kindness does not forsake the living or the dead. And she says, this man is a close relative of ours, one of our redeemers. He is one of our
Hmm.
redeemers. He's somebody that can bring us back into the family. He's somebody that can provide for us. He's somebody that can buy back or provide for what has been lost. This is the concept of a kinsman redeemer.
What's interesting here is that when Naomi loses her husband, her two sons, she tries to send the two daughters-in-law back to their families. Just like you're saying, even in non-Jewish culture, what would a widow do? She would go back into the safety and security of her family. Ruth chooses not to. That famous passage, wherever you go, I will go. Your God will be my God. And she goes with her. When Boaz sees Ruth's devotion to her mother-in-law, the word hesed, loving kindness, or perhaps here translated loyalty, is a good translation of it. He is so impressed because she doesn't owe Naomi a family relationship. Had she been her daughter, why, of course, she would come home with her and she would go glean the fields and get food for the two of them. But when he sees that Ruth, who is not biologically related to Naomi, does that, he is so impressed with her loyalty. And so she's behaving like a family member, even though she's not a biological family member.
Right.
Naomi needs to find, she needs to get, like you said, connected back into the family. And so even though Boaz isn't the nearest relative, he is one of the relatives. And so Naomi and Ruth are just trying to survive, but Naomi's being smart about it. She wants to reintroduce herself into the family.
Right. This is where a story that could have been a story of duty becomes a story of love, in that
Hmm.
Boaz sees Ruth and she catches his eye and he loves her and he wants to redeem her, but he's not the nearest redeemer. So you see
Right.
this in chapter 3 and chapter 4. There's this arrangement they have to make. And he goes to the person who is the nearest redeemer and says, hey, Naomi's back. Husband and sons have died. There's a plot of land. It needs to be redeemed. And the guy's thinking, okay, this is good. But he says, but also, if you're going to redeem the land, you have to redeem the daughter in law, who is Ruth. And at that point, the guy backs out because he says it will endanger his own inheritance. So there's something financially that if he marries Ruth, it's going to compromise either what he's getting or what he's giving in his inheritance. So he backs out, which of course is what Boaz wanted. And he marries Ruth, and he takes Naomi in and provides for them as a family. So this story, this concept, is one of those building blocks to understand what Jesus does. Jesus is pretty obviously the kinsman redeemer for us, for God's people. He is the link back into the family. And the word
Hmm.
redemption is used all over the New Testament. He's redeemed us from the curse of the law, for example, Paul says in Galatians chapter 3. He's redeemed us through the blood of his cross. He's paid the penalty. He's paid the debt of servitude that we owed. We have gone bankrupt. We have given ourselves in servitude over to sin and death. Jesus has paid the penalty of sin and death to redeem us, to buy us back and bring us back into our family. There's a really cool connection here with the parables that Jesus tells of the lost sheep, the lost coin, and the lost son, the prodigal son. In the first two parables, Jesus is telling these to the Pharisees. People go out and look for what's lost. That's what you did in a family. If somebody was lost, if something happened, You took it on yourself to go and make things right. And so the shepherd goes and
Hmm.
looks for the sheep, the woman goes and looks for the coin. And then in the parable of the prodigal son, which most people are familiar with the basic story, this element needs to be there, but it isn't. The older brother should go look for the younger brother. He should go bring him back,
Right.
but he doesn't. And this is part of the critique against the Pharisees. They are the quote unquote older brothers of Israel. They're
Right.
the leaders of Israel, but they don't care at all about the Israelites who are lost. In fact, Jesus later in Matthew says, "Woe to you, because you will travel across land and sea to make a proselyte, to convert somebody." And then I think Jesus says, you make them just as much a son of hell as you are." So they
Right.
were they were standing in the door, he says, instead of letting people in. So the point that Jesus is making here is somebody should be out looking for these people. There needs to be a
Hmm.
kinsman redeemer. And of course, Jesus' own mission that he says over and over and again is to seek and save the lost. Jesus is the one who went out and looked, who went out and purchased the lost family members and brought them back into the family of God. This gives us a real life picture of what Jesus was doing in bringing Ruth back into the family of Boaz.
Exactly. This is really the most basic idea of the kinsman redeemer. It did happen that you became bankrupt and you would have to sell yourself into a term of slavery, a bond servant, to pay off your debts. And it was incumbent, if they could and if they were willing, on the kinsman redeemer to pay your debt for you, to redeem you. And that literally is the picture of what Jesus is doing. And Cole, I think that's what's happening with in the beginning of this story. You see Naomi and her husband, the two sons, they leave Bethlehem, they leave Israel and go to Moab. They do that to avoid having to sell himself into slavery, which would be humiliating and put a burden on his family. They go to Moab, where he thinks he's going to do well. Of course, the boys marry, he dies, the two boys die, and now Naomi comes back and this has to have been like the worst calamity, even worse than being bankrupt and having to leave Israel, is to come back and to be completely devastated. No sons, no husband, no money, and looking to reconnect with the family.
Yeah.
She could not see God's hand in that hardship. But by the end of this story, it gets turned around.
Yeah, there's a couple things you mentioned in there that are interesting connections to the New Testament. This story starts in Bethlehem. It's not the first time that Bethlehem is mentioned in the Old Testament. The first time is in Genesis 35, where Rachel is buried on the way to Bethlehem. It's near Bethlehem. It's mentioned in Judges a few times. There is a judge from there. We didn't mention him in the last episode because we don't know anything about him, but his name is Ibzan, who's from there. Curiously, this is kind of interesting. In Judges 17, the Levite who is going to go be the priest in this household
Hmm.
is from Bethlehem. And it says about him that he's from the tribe of Judah and a Levite. And this is fascinating because he is not a good character in this story, but he's got great lineage. In fact, he's one of maybe three people in the Bible who have the kingly and the priestly line together. We think,
Right.
the author of Hebrews says Jesus is from the tribe of Judah, so he can't be a priest, but he's a priest in the order of Melchizedek. So he has this other line. Well, this priest is from Judah, maybe on his dad's side, and he's a Levite on his mom's side. And so he has all the qualities to be what God calls the Messiah to be, but of course he isn't. But this person is
Hmm.
from Bethlehem. So there's a great foreshadowing there of this Judah and Levite person from Bethlehem. The concubine in Judges 19 is also from Bethlehem. And this is a lot of mentions for a very small town.
Hmm.
It's not even listed in the towns where people are divided up in the land because it's so small. So this just signals to us there's something coming in this place. Of course, the upshot of this story is because Boaz is from Bethlehem, which is where Naomi's husband Elimelech is from, then their family is going to continue to live there. And David is born in Bethlehem, becomes known as the city of David. And then, of course, Jesus is born there as well. So that there's an interesting piece that's a smaller theme, but pops out to you. Naomi, one of the other things here that points us to Christ is Naomi has a hard time seeing God's hand in the difficulties in her life. So she says at the beginning of the story that the Lord is against me. The Lord has gone out
Hmm.
against me because of what's happened. And so when she comes back, she says, I don't want you to call me Naomi anymore. I want you to call me Mara, which means bitter, for the Lord has dealt bitterly with me. Which you got to imagine the people in Bethlehem saying, man, things have really gone poorly for
Yeah.
Naomi. She's coming back, changed her name to Mara. But after Boaz redeems Ruth, there's this full circle. The bitterness comes from she thinks God is against her. But of course, we as the reader know that God is not against her. He's using these difficulties for his purpose. They just can't see it yet. After
Hmm.
Boaz redeems Ruth in chapter 4, the women come to Naomi, presumably these same women who she said, call me Mara. They said, blessed be the Lord who has not left you this day without a redeemer, and may his name be renowned in Israel. He shall be to you a restorer of life and a nourisher of your old age, for your daughter in law, who loves you, who is more to you than 7 sons, has given birth to this child. So this is cool. Their child's name is Obed, and Obed means worshiper. And so things have really come full circle for Naomi. And this is a theme too that runs all through scripture. The hardship of our lives is something that should point us to what God is doing. There we may not see
Hmm.
it immediately. In fact, we almost never do. We're in chapter 1 thinking God must be against us. This is bitter. This is horrible. But God is bringing us to chapter 4 eventually, where we say, blessed be God for what has happened here. And the reason this points us to Jesus is because this is exactly what happens with Jesus. He does not triumph through the normal path of success. He triumphs
Hmm.
by dying, by God, in a sense, not, we wouldn't say this theologically, but in a sense, everybody looking around says, he must be cursed by God because
Right.
of what happened to him. Because that's when you're crucified, that's what happens to you. You are cursed. You are a slave. You're the lowest of the low. But in fact, he was the highest of the high. He was the King of glory who died a slave's death so that we could be reunited. So this theme is important for us pastorally for the difficulties that we go through, but it's also something that points us to Christ, that Naomi loses sight of God's hand in her hardship. And then by the end, she sees that God was actually working towards his goals and his promises through what happened to her in the story.
Yeah, that's a theme, like you said. You see it with Job. You see it with Jacob having to flee his inheritance because
Hmm.
his brother is going to kill him. And you see people that it looks like their life is very bitter and that God must have something against them. And then,
Hmm.
of course, as we read the stories, we realize nothing could be further from the truth. Do you know what really strikes me about this is when the women say to Naomi, blessed be the Lord who has not left you without a redeemer.
Mm.
So, it's bad enough that your husband died, your sons died, you're in this difficult situation. Okay, that's a bad thing. But you know what would be really catastrophic, according to what their thought is there's no one in your family that will come to your aid.
Mm.
And so they say, blessed is the Lord because you have a redeemer. And I
Right.
think, I think about Paul talking about this phrase stuck in my mind, Cole, when he talked about without, he speaks about us as Gentiles, that we used to be without God and without hope in the
Mm.
world. And it's only because we have a redeemer that we have any hope
Right.
whatsoever. That just really strikes me that God's way of blessing us is not leaving us without a lifeline, without a
Right.
redeemer.
Yeah, it's an amazing theme that runs through the Bible, but it runs through our lives as well. The last thing I want to point out is at the end of the story, you see things come full circle, and there's a direct, it's not a reference, but there's a direct line to Christ that comes out of the end of this story. So Ruth, if you remember from the beginning, she's a Moabite. She's not Jewish. She's not an Israelite, but she marries in. And the Moabites are historically enemies of Israel, not somebody you would expect God to use in his story. But at the end of the book of Ruth, there's a little genealogical note and it says um, that the son has been born to Naomi. They name him Obed, and they go through the generations of Perez all the way down to Boaz. So Salmon fathered Boaz, Boaz fathered Obed, Obed fathered Jesse, and Jesse fathered David. Of course, this is King David. So this is one of the reasons this story is a bridge between the Judges and First Samuel, is this
Hmm.
gives you the line to get to David. Because at this
Right.
point we've actually lost the thread a little bit from the sons of Israel down to
Hmm.
David, but we find out later that David is from the tribe of Judah. The reason we know that is because we can trace this line through Boaz. This is the continuation of the tribe of Judah. Of course, this is repeated in Chronicles, it's repeated in Matthew, it's repeated in Luke. But this story provides that link from the time of the settlement of the promised land. The line of Judah runs all the way up to when David is born in Bethlehem. Of course, the other thing interesting here is um, Salmon is the one who ends up marrying Rahab. If you remember when we talked about
Hmm.
the book of Joshua, Rahab saves the people from, or she saves the spies, and they save her from destruction in Jericho. She joins the Israelites, and she marries
Hmm.
Salmon, and so their son. This is really interesting to think about. Their son is Boaz, and I've always thought about this. How did Boaz get it in his mind to be so hospitable and
Hmm.
so selfless with his resources when it comes to Ruth? Well, it's because that's exactly what he had seen in his home. His dad and was the same way with this foreign woman who comes into Israel, marries her, they have Boaz, and he goes and does likewise. So
Hmm.
there's this very cool thread in this family. The thing that points to Jesus here, though, is that this is the line of Christ. So when you get to Matthew chapter 1 and you see the genealogy, there are four Gentile women in this genealogy, one of whom is Ruth. And
Hmm.
her, she marrying in to the family of Judah, marrying Boaz, is the way that God chose to have his son descend from Judah. So there's Moabite blood, all the way down the generations
Hmm.
running through the Savior's veins. And so this is the way that God brings people into his family, not just as on the periphery, right into the center of the family. This Moabite woman comes, and she is a great, 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 however many grandmother of the
She's,
Messiah.
yeah, exactly. It's, you get this promise to Abraham that, through him, all the nations of the earth will be blessed. And then later, as you move through the Old Testament, you get prophecies about the Messiah and his relationship with the Gentiles and bringing the Gentiles in. And I think I see this as God sort of foreshadowing that by bringing Gentiles into the very lineage of the Messiah.
Yeah, it's a story of redemption all the way around. You
Hmm.
have redemption in this particular case, but like you're saying, the story of Abraham is a story of redemption, that the world
Hmm.
will be redeemed through his descendants, particularly in Christ, and then generally in what God does through the story of his descendants and through the church today. This is one giant story of how God is redeeming the world. And of course, there are seasons where Israel does not live up to that promise. They are very internally focused, they're forsaking God, and yet God is still good on his promise. He is going to bless the world through the descendants of Abraham. And you get a little piece of it here in this story that
Hmm.
Boaz views himself as someone who needs to redeem and who needs to bless. And of course, his descendant, Jesus, is the one who does that ultimately and saves us from our sins. But we get this concept of redemption so clearly in this story, and it helps us to understand what Jesus does in the New Testament.
One last thing I'd observe about the kinsman redeemer idea is we don't use this word in relation to it, but it has the idea of grace incorporated into it because someone who, let's say they went bankrupt and they sold themselves into slavery, and if you could, you were to buy them back. Nowhere in that obligation does it say whose fault it was. And you don't have to buy them back if they just squandered their money, or
Hmm.
it doesn't matter about the fault, your obligation to redeem them. And the idea there is they may not deserve it. They may have gotten themselves into that fix, but it's an act of grace. And to me, that is a foreshadowing of we sold ourselves into sin, and Jesus, by grace, redeemed us out of it. It is that same idea. It just comes to its full flower in the New Testament.